Welcome to Chat Cyber, a podcast on all things cyber policy where we explore key issues and discuss policy strategies with industry experts.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Chat Cyber, Cyber Florida's policy podcast. I'm your host, James Jacobs, Cyber Florida's Associate Director for Partnerships and Policy.
And I am your co-host, Jordan Diulis, Cyber Policy Analyst at Cyber Florida.
We'd like to thank you guys for tuning back in for another episode. Today we have the good Dr. Stephen Neely. You guys are in for a real trip today. This guy, unfortunately for him or me, we haven't decided which, is counted among one of my very best friends. He works at the School of Public Affairs, but I'm going to let Jordan dive off into his very, very illustrious biographical information. Jordan, can you introduce us to the good Dr.
Yes,
Neely?
Absolutely.
It'll be all lies.
Dr. Stephen Neely is an associate professor and currently the director of the Master of Public Administration program here at the University of South Florida. He completed his undergraduate degree in English at the University of Pittsburgh. He continued his education at Point Park University, where he received a master's in business administration, then went on to earn a master's in social and public policy analysis at Duquesne University. He then earned his PhD in public administration from North Carolina State University. Dr. Neely has numerous publications and has completed many research reports and surveys, of which some were in collaboration with Cyber Florida, which leads us to our topic of discussion today. Dr. Neely, thank you so much for joining us today to discuss ransomware.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
And he really doesn't like the University of Clemson and gets very angry if you put a P in Clemson.
Okay, you're not going to put that in your podcast.
There's a high chance we will. So you're going to get
prefer you didn't. Half my friends graduated from there.
You're going to get a kick out of this. Our first segment, we do a segment called Explain It to James, where you take a very complicated concept and you explain it as if you're explaining it to a small child. So knowing that, can you briefly explain ransomware attacks, what they are, and how they negatively impact organizations, and provide a few examples?
Sure. So a ransomware attack is an attack that uses what we call malicious software. We all use software every day. We use all kinds of software applications on our phone, on our computers, to do the tasks, run the apps that we enjoy playing with. Some software is designed with malicious intent, and it's designed to gain access to your system so that it can obtain information, so that it can obtain access to critical systems that you use to run daily operations within your organization. So ransomware attacks use this malicious software to gain unauthorized access to computer systems, to gain access to information or to critical functions within an organization. And then what these bad actors do is they demand a ransom in exchange for either releasing that information, not releasing that information in some cases, and for giving you access to your systems again. So what makes ransomware attacks so effective is that they're simple. They usually leverage a really simple attack vector like an infected link, having you click on a link in an email that will access that bad software, or they'll rely on things like leaked passwords. We all remember the really major ransomware attack against the Colonial Pipeline back in 2021.
Yes.
It led to huge gas shortages on the East Coast, surging gas prices. That all boiled down to a leaked password. Someone let their password out to log into a system, and that's all it takes for ransomware actors often to get into these systems to gain this illicit access to information. And then they can threaten to disrupt essential services, like the flow of gasoline, like your 911 call system, like medical software that's being used for procedures. We have an example in Tallahassee here in Florida just last year where Tallahassee Memorial Hospital, they never admitted that this was a ransomware attack, but all the kind of expert assessments of it leaned in that direction. But they were forced to divert patients from the emergency room to other facilities, which is, of course, very dangerous, a very serious situation. They were forced to cancel non-emergency procedures, move a lot of procedures to other facilities. So major disruption to healthcare services throughout the Tallahassee area because of this type of attack. And then the other thing that makes them so effective is that they're very strategic in how they set ransoms. So a ransom isn't going to be an outrageous demand that no organization is going to meet. It's actually going to be a demand that pales in comparison to the cost of reestablishing your systems on your own. So they gain access to an organization's systems, let's say a hospital. They take these critical systems offline, or they gain access to sensitive information and they threaten to release that information. The ransom they demand in exchange for that is going to be much less than the cost of, say, the reputational hit of having that data released, or much less than the cost of rebuilding those systems from scratch to get rid of the malicious software. And so what makes them so effective really is the simplicity and the strategic thinking behind these attacks.
So just to set the scene, as you know, in 2023, Cyber Florida conducted a statewide analysis to assess the cyber readiness of Florida's critical infrastructure. Based on the results of that assessment, we provided several recommendations to the state legislature aimed at improving cyber resiliency within the state. Among those recommendations was a call to close the maturity gap for basic ransomware readiness by 2025. You then contributed to a policy brief as a consultant in collaboration with Cyber Florida that dives a bit deeper into the ransomware aspect of the assessment and elaborates more on the specific recommendation of closing the maturity gap for basic ransomware readiness. So before we get into that, the policy brief itself, can you give us a little bit of background on the assessment?
I can, but let me, if I could, in the spirit of explaining it to James, let me
Yes, please.
let me just clarify that term.
Everything you just said.
Let me just clarify that term, though, maturity gap. What we mean is the gap between the best practices that organizations should be practicing to protect themselves from ransomware attacks and what they actually are practicing right now. And so our goal was to measure a baseline of what are organizations, what are critical infrastructure providers in the state of Florida in particular doing right now compared to the standard of what they should be doing.
Sure.
And for that standard, we went to kind of the gold standard, which is the CSET, the cybersecurity evaluation tool, which was developed by Idaho National Laboratories on behalf of the Department of Homeland Security. And within that very large tool is what's called the Ransomware Readiness Assessment. Ransomware Readiness Assessment is something on the order of 48 questions that measure ransomware readiness at 3 different levels, or measure the readiness of an organization to prevent and or respond to a ransomware incident. And so the items in that assessment are divided into 3 levels. There's basic ransomware readiness, there's intermediate, and advanced ransomware readiness. When we talk about this assessment, this report that Cyber Florida put out, we are talking about basic ransomware readiness. We're talking about the lowest, kind of most simplified level of readiness. And we find that within that section, or within that area alone, very few organizations in the state of Florida's critical infrastructure providers are following all of the best practices. Only about 15% meet all of the criteria for basic ransomware readiness. So when we talk about closing the maturity gap, what we mean is getting those CI providers across the state in any sector, be it government, be it defense, be it utilities. We want to see all of those organizations meeting at least the basic thresholds for ransomware readiness. And so that's where this report was really focused. In terms of the assessment itself, it's important to note that this was an opt-in assessment. Organizations from all sectors were encouraged to complete the survey, but it's definitely, or I shouldn't say survey, I should say the assessment tool, but it's definitely heavily over-representative of providers within the government sector. Mm-hmm. And those are, unsurprisingly in a lot of ways, those are the critical infrastructure providers who performed the worst on this assessment. Oh. When I say unsurprising, I mean because governments tend to have a lot more demands on their resources, which tend to be more limited. So it's very difficult in a lot of cases for them to have the staff and personnel and the expertise needed to really develop these kind of ransomware protections and other cyber protections. Whereas with private industry, these are a little more common and they're able to pay employees a little better who have these skill sets. And so I'm rambling at this point.
No, that's all great information. I think everything that you're saying is really important and relevant.
So in light of that information, can you tell us where in the assessment did we see the largest gaps in readiness? You mentioned a certain sector, government, but what specifically are the actions that they aren't doing that we should be seeing them do in order to close that gap?
So a lot of organizations are doing a lot of really good things. Unique passwords, strong passwords, web browser security settings. We have, firewalls being patched and vulnerabilities contained pretty quickly within most of the responding organizations. The areas where we see some real problems, some of them are with planning and practicing cyber readiness plans. So less than half, only about 43% of organizations reported that they had developed an annual incident response plan that included ransomware responses. Mm-hmm. Okay, only about half of the organizations say that they've removed unsupported hardware from their systems, that they're practicing regular phishing exercises. So it's kind of that looking ahead. A lot of organizations here are really response ready, but we don't want to just respond to these attacks. We want to prevent them. And so we want to see organizations looking ahead, practicing some of these drills, preparing themselves for what they do when these kind of attack threats, when these kind of threats arise. And that's what we're not seeing a lot of in some of the responses.
So specifically in looking at the policy brief, can you expand a little bit on the recommendations that were provided to the state legislature related to ransomware readiness?
I can, but let me preface that by saying that this is a really vexing problem for government, because we're looking at across 16 sectors that we've defined as critical infrastructure, and none of them are the same. They're all unique. They're all unique in the services they provide. They're all unique in the prevailing organizational models that they use. They're all unique in terms of the regulatory authorities that they answer to. And so it's very difficult for government to legislate ransomware readiness in a way that would be coherent and effective. And so we are not so much trying to prescribe to the Florida legislature or the state of Florida or anyone else what action should look like, so much as to remind them of the urgency of the action needed. So we do offer some recommendations to try to close the gap, with a goal of closing this basic ransomware readiness gap by the end of 2025. But these are less about specific pieces of legislation than broad steps we think the state could take to try to achieve that goal. One of those would be coordination. Try to coordinate a ransomware readiness task force at the state level, much like has been done at the national level with the Joint Ransomware Task Force. Try to bring the stakeholders together to start having conversations and guiding efforts and being deliberate about trying to build ransomware readiness into goals and plans across these diverse sectors. Another would be delegation. Try to delegate this task where possible to the appropriate regulating agency, the appropriate regulating body, the appropriate organizing interests, whether that be an interest like the Florida League of Cities, the Florida City County Management Association, an organization that doesn't necessarily have regulatory authority but has the ear of an industry and has access to that industry and has trust within that industry. Try to find those stakeholders, try to bring them to the table and delegate some of the authorities, try to delegate some of the workload to those organizations so that you can reach all of these diverse sectors, recognizing that there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution across 16 unique sectors. Third piece that's really important, really critical, is tracking. Old Peter Drucker adage: you can't manage what you don't measure. We can't manage ransomware readiness if we're not measuring our progress toward it. If we're not establishing benchmarks, if we're not establishing best practices and then measuring how well we're doing them. The great news is we already have a template for that when it comes to ransomware readiness. We have the 18 items included in the CSET, in the basic ransomware readiness module, that tell us the best practices that should be followed within organizations that provide critical infrastructure services. Idaho National Laboratories, the Department of Homeland Security, they're constantly updating these standards. They're constantly monitoring best practices within the industry. And so they know what needs to be done at the organizational level. We just need to be tracking our progress toward that. And then providing informational and resource support. This is something the state can directly do. They have to recognize that a lot of organizations, particularly in the private the public or nonprofit sectors, simply do not have the resources to bring on staff, to adopt some of these steps, to buy some of the products they need. And the state can provide support in these cases. And that might be resource sharing, that might be personnel sharing, that might be getting information out to these organizations through trusted channels. But the state really has an opportunity to be proactive in promoting ransomware readiness with these organizations by providing informational, personnel, and resource support that they need to achieve these levels of readiness.
Okay, so in light of that, since you've written that report, Dr. Neely, is there anything else that you would like to add, anything that's occurred to you since then that you've seen that you wish that policymakers had in front of them now in terms of recommendations?
In terms of recommendations, I think that we've given a pretty clear picture of what we believe the state needs to be looking at moving forward. What I would really underscore is the urgency of the moment. I spent most of my morning learning and teaching some of my fellow researchers about some of the really amazing things that ChatGPT can do to advance our efforts. But we all know there's also a really dark side to these emerging technologies and the way that they can enhance threats like ransomware. We have to be ready for the fact that what is basic ransomware readiness today will be outdated tomorrow. And if we don't act quickly to achieve basic ransomware readiness in some of our key organizations that provide critical services to the state, then we're just going to keep falling further and further behind as the threats evolve. And they're evolving rapidly. And the ability to use artificial intelligence to develop deepfake ransomware threats, threats that can really compel employees to release some of that sensitive information that would help intruders gain access to systems. Those are on the horizon and coming now. And organizations have to be ready and have to be looking at the best practices to protect their systems against these evolving threats. And like I said, if we're behind now, then what does that mean when these threats start being used against local governments and critical infrastructure providers here in Florida? And so I think there's a real urgency to the moment and that we are at a bit of an inflection point with critical infrastructure in this country, in this state, where we really have to step up the readiness and step up our game, or we're going to fall behind some really rapidly evolving threats.
Great. Thank you. So one final question just to close this out here. In your opinion, what impact can an organization like Cyber Florida have on society's relationship with ransomware?
Huge. The state of Florida is so well positioned to lead in the face of some of these emerging issues because of organizations like Cyber Florida. And I think what Cyber Florida can provide, perhaps better than anything, is coordination. Yes, research support. Yes, technical support. Yes, informational support. But really the coordination of efforts across these diverse sectors, across a very diverse and rapidly growing state. Cyber Florida can kind of bring some order to the chaos by bringing all of these resources to bear, helping to connect strategic partners where appropriate, helping to provide a trusted source of information and guidance and training, helping to really work to partner with the University of South Florida and other institutions in the state university system to help prepare the future cyber workforce, which will help organizations to evolve in the face of these threats as they emerge.
We appreciate you sharing that information with us. And based on our relationship, it's easy to banter back and forth, but I can tell you in all seriousness, we really appreciate the time you spent with us today. And our listeners, you can see some of the world-class minds that we have access to here working with the University of South Florida through Cyber Florida. And these are the type recommendations and resources that we can bring to bear in helping you and your institutions determine the best steps forward. So that's the type resource that we want to be. Neely, we just want to thank you again for taking time with us today. Jordan, with that said, can you take us out?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you, Dr. Neely. We appreciate you joining us today. I think it was a really interesting conversation, and thank you so much.
Absolutely.
All opinions expressed by the Chat Cyber podcast participants are their own and do not exclusively represent the views and opinions of Cyber Florida.